Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Pepis, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is Frans de Waal, the C.H. Chandler Professor of Psychology at Emory University and the Director of the Living Links Center at the Yerkes National Primate Center in Atlanta, Georgia. De Waal is a biologist and primatologist known for his work on the behavior and social intelligence of primates. His latest research concerns empathy and cooperation, inequity, aversion, and social cognition in chimpanzees, bonobos, and other species. De Waal's latest books are The Age of Empathy and The Bonobo and the Atheist. On March 10, 2015, de Waal gave a talk, The Evolution of Connectivity, Empathy, Altruism, and Primate Social Skills at the Oregon Humanities Center as the 2014-15 Clark Lecturer. His lecture was part of the Connection series. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you.
What led to your interest in primates and their behavior?
Well, I'm interested in all sorts of animals, and as a child I was already interested in animals, and primates was sort of secondary. Although, of course, once I worked with primates, I noticed how easy it was to make parallels with human behavior, which made it very interesting in many ways.
You began your career with primates working with chimpanzees. How did your views about chimpanzees change over your time working with them?
Oh, I think when I started working, the view of chimpanzees was quite simplistic. So we knew that they used tools, but, and that they had a complex social life, but how much cognition went into all of this, we really didn't know so well. I think over the last 30, 40 years, the knowledge about chimpanzees has greatly increased, and of course, it has been the most important part of poking holes in the wall between humans and animals, because we always compare ourselves with chimpanzees as the close relative. So we're not so worried necessarily that elephants are smart or dolphins, but the chimpanzees, if they get too smart, we make whole movies about chimpanzees who get too smart. And yeah, that's a big worry that we have.
So when you started your career, there was a particular interest in chimpanzees as violent, right? And aggressive. And that's what you studied at first, right?
At first, yeah, because in the 60s and 70s, I started in the 70s, people couldn't talk about anything else than aggression and violence. And this was, Conrad Lawrence had written this book on aggression, which explained that humans have an aggressive instinct. This was right after World War II. And there were basically, if you had books on human evolution, it was all about violence and aggression. And I studied aggression in chimpanzees. And in that context, I discovered that most of the time they are actually peaceful, and in addition, after fights they reconcile and they kiss and embrace each other. And I found that actually more interesting than the aggression itself, which unfolds in a particular way and at some point becomes predictable.
So what are the implications for that realization about chimpanzees reconciling for our understanding of human beings?
Yeah, I think it had a big impact in the sense that once it was discovered in chimpanzees, it was discovered in many other species. And so people started to realize that yes, these animals are competitive and they can be aggressive, but at the same time they're worried about their social relationships, because why else would they need to reconcile after fights? And so it shifted the perspective on, and I've basically been busy in the last 30 years or so shifting the perspective on how we look at society as not necessarily a place of competition, although that's definitely part of it, but also a place of integration and solidarity and cooperation and so on.
You started working with chimpanzees, but then you started working with bonobos. Chimpanzees are very closely related to humans. Bonobos are as well, is that right?
Exactly, equally close.
Equally close.
And they're sometimes forgotten because we live by these human evolutionary scenarios that we basically got where we are by wiping out everyone else, including the Neanderthals and everybody who was in competition with us. And so that's sort of the standard scenario that they have in anthropology, is that we are an aggressive species which has always been aggressive and will always be aggressive, and that's how we got where we are. And then the bonobo comes along and was very inconvenient because it's equally close to us as the chimp, and the bonobo doesn't do anything of this. And so bonobos, when the groups meet, there is some hostility, but most of the time they end up having sex and grooming, and so it's not nearly as violent as what the chimpanzees do. And so the bonobo became a sort of inconvenient, a black sheep sort of evolutionary theory, in the sense that they didn't know what to do with them. They didn't fit that whole scenario. And as a result, some anthropologists have tried to sideline the bonobo and say, well, it's not relevant, it's sort of an offshoot, an irrelevant offshoot. It's a marvelous species, but we don't need them. And I've always argued that they're exactly equally close, and recently the genome data came out on the bonobo and confirmed that genetically they are exactly equally close as the chimpanzee, so we cannot just act as if they don't exist.
So this, the argument that you're countering that there are offshoots, that there are exceptions. Your most recent book is titled The Bonobo and the Atheist. Clearly, that's at the center of your argument. First, explain the title, The Bonobo and the Atheist. Who's the atheist?
Yeah, the bonobo is not the atheist necessarily. It could be the atheist. Although if the bonobo was a bit more savvy, you would say I'm an agnostic. That's more acceptable term, you know. No, it is because each time I'm interested in the evolution of morality, and each time I talk about that, there are people, especially here in the US, who say morality comes from God or morality comes from religion. And I'm not opposed to religion necessarily, even though I'm not religious myself. So I'm not a rabid anti-religion atheist, as some of the biologists at the moment are. Mm-hmm. But I also feel religion is very young, and our current religions are a couple of thousand years, and you're not going to tell me that 100,000 years ago human communities did not have some sort of sense of fairness and rules of conduct and punish murderers or whatever. They must have had some sort of morality. And independent of our current Christianity or whatever the religion is you want to choose for this. And so in the book I address that issue. I address the origins of morality, and I take the bonobo as an example of a primate behavior that relates to that, and how does it connect with religion, or maybe does not connect to religion.
So the subtitle of the book is The Search for Humanism Among the Primates. So what did your search reveal? Is there humanism there?
Well, I think many of the principles of humanism, sort of humanism, if you define it as trusting in human nature to do the right thing for our society, so to speak. Yeah, I think many of human nature is primate nature in some way, and it's a special form of primate nature, and so primate nature has many of these elements that we value, such as empathy and compassion and a sense of fairness, and many of these principles we have absorbed into our moral systems. I'm not claiming that a bonobo or a chimp is a moral being. I have my doubts about that, even though some people want me to go that far and say they are moral beings. I'm not 100% sure, because I think human morality has certain special characteristics, such as normativity and reasoned judgment and justification of why we do things this way or that way. And so I'm staying away from that issue necessarily, because I think there's some differences.
The book begins with you talking about Hieronymus Bosch's very famous triptych, The Garden of Earthly Delights. Why did you start the book there?
Well, Bosch he's a Dutch painter, and I'm from the city where he was born and where he worked. And I've always been fascinated by him, but he's often called a moralizing or a moralistic painter. And what people usually mean is that he's very religious. He lived in the 15th century. And so people think he's very religious, he's very Christian. This is Christian morality that he depicts. But actually he's sort of undermining it, in my opinion. He was already in a time where people got interested in humanist ideals, and there were certain doubts about religion. And it's sort of very surprising that the Spanish kings accepted his paintings instead of decapitating him, which would have been an appropriate response, I think, given what he did. So he was playing around with his doubts about religion. And so, yes, there are certain scenes, and they're very famous, where he has a hell, and everyone who does the wrong thing in life, they will end up in a terrible hell that he creates in his paintings. And that's maybe why people call him moralistic. But there's other parts, like in the Garden of Earthly Delights, where he has a lot of frolicking nudes around, which are more bonobo-like lifestyle there in the middle of the painting. And he's not punishing those guys. If you look at the right-hand side of the painting, he's not punishing those people. He's punishing sometimes even nuns and priests. He's punishing all sorts of characters. Yeah.
So you've begun to sort of explain how you became interested in these questions of religion and morality. did you bring that to the study of primates, or did primates bring you to the study, this interest in the origin and the evolution of morality?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of the two. Is that if for example, I usually start with observation. I'm not much of a theoretician, and so I observe my animals, and they give me ideas, and I think, why are they doing this, or why are they doing that? And so I discovered a behavior that I call consolation behavior, where let's say a chimpanzee loses a fight and is screaming, and another comes over, embraces them, calms them down. And one time I was at a meeting of child psychologists who said, we study empathy, and the way we study that is asking someone in the family to cry, and then we see how young children respond to them. And I said, well, if that's empathy, then I have plenty of empathy in my animals. And so that's how I made the jump to empathy. And that's now becoming actually an increasingly popular topic. There's even now rodent studies on empathy and dog studies on empathy. So that's how I got into that. And from empathy, it was not a small step to morality, because as soon as you look into the empathy literature, morality comes into focus. And so I sort of expanded from there. Yeah.
So you mentioned fairness. Tell us about the experiments you've done that have indicated that there's a practice of fairness among primates.
Yeah, the fairness studies we got, that's again an observation. We noticed in the lab, we were doing experiments with monkeys, that they are sensitive to what somebody else is getting. Now, they should not be sensitive to that. They should just care, how much effort do I put in my work, and what do I get for that? And why would you then look at what somebody else... But we noticed that they were paying attention to that, and that if someone else got a better reward, they were upset by that. And so we started experimenting with that, and we found that monkeys systematically have this reaction, is that if they do the same job as somebody else, and they get much lesser reward for it, and they get very upset by it. If they get a better reward, they're not upset by it. Now, the interesting thing is that once we move to chimpanzees, which have a much larger brain than the capuchin monkey, in the chimpanzees we notice very similar reactions to humans, is that if they got more than somebody else, they also got upset. And so we now have a paper out. Sarah Brosnan and I just wrote a paper on the sense of fairness, because many experiments have been done, including on dogs and on crows and other species. And we are concluding that there's sort of two levels of it. One is that you get upset by getting less than somebody else, and the other one is that you try to equalize outcomes for the both of you, and that humans and chimpanzees fall in the second category, but maybe only humans and chimpanzees. We have no evidence for other species.
Now, you've also observed other modes of altruism in primates. Tell us about those experiments. What did you find there?
Yeah, we're interested in pro-social behavior, and I think that the empathy altruism mechanism is a case where you get a stake in somebody. So what empathy does is you get a stake in somebody else, in the sense that someone is distressed and this distresses you, and as a result you have a stake in the other. And that's an empathy mechanism, but it makes also that you're willing to help the other, and that when you help the other, it also relieves some of your own suffering, so to speak. And so nature has built us in a way that actually we get a certain pleasure out of helping others, at least certain others, maybe not everybody. And we're interested in that kind of mechanism in animals. And so in chimpanzees or in monkeys, we do experiments where they have the opportunity to help somebody else. So they can do a task and they can get rewarded themselves, but it can also happen that they can both get rewarded in the task. And actually both the monkeys and the chimps prefer a situation where both of them get rewarded. So they have a certain interest in the welfare of somebody else.
Now, you mentioned in passing that there have been studies in about these issues in other animals besides primates, and I know that you've worked with elephants and dolphins. Tell us a little bit about what you found in there. Okay, we know that we're closely related to primates, but dolphins, elephants.
They all have mammalian brains. And so that's also why I'm not surprised that the rodents are now being used for studies on empathy. We think actually that empathy started with maternal care, because the females of every species need to be responsive to the distress of their offspring, or the hunger, or if they're in danger, and so on. And so, and since maternal care is obligatory in the mammals, you're going to find it in all the mammals. And so I don't think an elephant brain is substantially different from a human brain. The elephant brain has actually more neurons. It's the only brain, I think, in the world that has more neurons than the human brain. And and so, yeah, there's a lot of speculation about what they're doing with all these neurons. And people have not really systematically tested them. So we know that elephants are very smart. I don't think anyone doubts that. But the systematic tests have not been done. And it's logical why they have not been done, because on a campus like, let's see, at the University of Oregon, I don't think you want to have a bunch of elephants walking around or in cages or whatever you would need to do experiments on them. And so what we do, Josh Plotnick has a site in Thailand where he has access to elephants who are used there for the tourist industry. And so he can bring them in and do tests on them. And we're interested in consolation. They show that behavior. We're interested in cooperation. We're interested in their general intelligence. So the most basic things have not even been tested. Their discrimination tasks, for example, which allow you to test their visual acuity, their olfactory sense, which is probably incredible, probably even 100 times better than a dog's. And so we haven't completely tested that out. And all these things need to be done.
So you say the current thinking is that these shared traits among mammals derive from maternal care. So is there a gendered distinction in the behavior of mammals? Are the males less altruistic? Are they less cooperative?
No, the males can be quite cooperative. Because cooperation doesn't always depend on empathy. So empathy is the one that is, I think, sex-linked. Cooperation is can be mutual benefit, and I think males are very good at understanding mutual benefit. So, but the empathy part, yes, there's universal in humans. It's more in females than in males. And in almost all the studies that we do on rodents or primates, we find a little bit more of altruistic behavior in the females than in the males. And another thing that's interesting is that oxytocin, which is really a maternal hormone. For example, if a woman is in labor and doesn't give birth quickly enough, we give her oxytocin. So oxytocin is a very important maternal hormone. And if you spray oxytocin in the nostrils of men or women, you get more empathic reactions from them. So that's another connection with the maternal care system. So it's not like as if men or males don't have empathy. Because once the empathy mechanism and the neural circuitry that was needed for it had evolved, it started to expand and be used in other relationships than just mother-offspring. It started to be used for friends and for family, and so males could use it. And so basically, in other relations, that same mechanism could be adopted, but the core mechanism is still a maternal care mechanism.
You've spoken about the differences between chimpanzees and bonobos. Is it the case that bonobos are more empathetic as a group than chimpanzees are?
That's my feeling. So I feel that bonobos are more empathic, and that may be one of the reasons that they're also less violent. And in the consolation studies that we've done, we've found very high levels of that in the bonobo. So my feeling is that they're more empathic, but I'm not sure we have the real standardized test to say that they are so much more or so much less than a chimpanzee. No.
You study what you call bottom-up morality, and a crucial part of your argument is, as you've said, that we know from these primate studies that there are evolutionary benefits to morality. There's evidence of evolutionary behaviors that we could begin to apply the term morality to. You mentioned very briefly in passing earlier in the interview your sense of what differentiates human morality from primate morality. What are the things that what are your views on that?
Well, I think we, especially at the higher level, sort of the group level. So if you look at the one-on-one relationships between individuals, even in dogs, you see that if a big dog bites a small dog and a small dog gives a yelp, the big dog will lick the small dog to restore the relationship, and then they continue playing. And so even at the one-on-one level, you see a lot of mechanisms in play that are very similar between, I think, let's say 2 dogs or 2 humans, and certainly between 2 chimpanzees or 2 humans. But when you go to the higher levels where we worry about our society and how do we want things to run in our society, do we accept thieves in our society? Like if I were a chimpanzee and I saw another individual steal from somebody else, then maybe I wouldn't care about that because I'm not unaffected by it. But we humans, we do care about that. If I see someone steal from someone else, I have this kind of reaction like, I don't want that kind of behavior in my society. Maybe also because I understand that it may affect me at some point. These people will steal from me also at some point. So I have a better understanding of what I want to occur and how I want people to behave in society as a whole. And I think that's where humans are really radically different, in that we have these worries about the larger scale society.
There's a level of abstract thinking that we seem capable of.
Yeah.
So this is obviously related to religion in particular, and you have some thoughts about the evolution of religion, because you mentioned earlier that we know that the large international religions that currently obtain, they're not that old. They're a couple of thousand years old. So, and there was clearly human societies prior to that. Your speculation is that those human societies were closer in terms of how morality operated to the way the primates operate. So how do you believe these large religious movements came into being?
They came into existence when we had large societies, and we have only large societies since the agricultural revolution. So that's 12,000 years ago or so. Before that time, we lived in societies. Well, maybe there were sometimes 1,000 people, but I would imagine even smaller than that. And when you get to these smaller societies, they become more similar to primate groups, and you get very different mechanisms. We all know each other. We know each other even by name. We have reputations. We gossip about each other. I can tell him about what you did to me, and so your reputation is going to be affected. And that's a very different set of mechanisms that once you go to an anonymous society with 1 million people, you cannot rely on that anymore. That doesn't work anymore. And I think that's where religions then came in. We don't know exactly how. Some people say, well, we installed an all-seeing God who kept an eye on everybody. Not all religions have that kind of gods, I think. But anyway, I think binding people together in some sort of community that has a shared belief may have helped the moral system to be maintained in these larger societies.
Now, a lot of the work that you do is at the Yerkes Center, and these are primates that are in environments that are natural-ish, but obviously they're in captivity.
Yeah.
Do you do work in the field with primates and other animals in the field?
No, I don't work in the field. I visit many field sites. I'm interested in what happens in the field and how animals behave. But I'm more interested at the moment in sort of cognitive testing, which is really very hard to do in the field, especially since many primates are neophobic. And so as soon as you put up a machine, people say such things as like, give them an iPad. And well, I know what happens to the iPad. Well, it's not going to live very long, I think. So it's very hard to do that in the field. And so I'm perfectly happy to be on the other end of the scale. So I do the controlled experiments, and the field workers do the observations. And the two at some point need to fit together somehow. And so the strongest evidence for primate cognition is, of course, if we have evidence from the field, they do this and this, and we test it in captivity, and we find support for the capacities. Yeah.
Is there evidence to suggest that these animals that are getting tested in captivity, that the fact that they're in captivity has had an impact on their responses to these tests? I mean, have we humanized them by putting them into captivity?
Captivity has definitely an effect on their behavior. It has to have that, because they're free from foraging constraints, so they can eat as much as they want. So whereas wild chimps or bonobos, the whole day they're basically working on getting enough food. So of course it has an effect. But it doesn't necessarily affect the profound psychology. You would, for example, take a human who lives in a city. It was also a sort of captivity. We live in little houses and drive around in little boxes. So the city human is like a captive primate, and you would still call him a human. You would still say that human has human responses and a human psychology, even though it's quite a different human from people who live in the forest and survive in that particular way.
And I assume that many of the behaviors that you've observed in captivity have also been observed in the wild. Is that right?
There's quite a bit of mutual support. So, for example, cooperation, we study a lot of cooperation. There's good evidence for that in the field. Reciprocity and exchange. Empathy responses have been observed. Reconciliation, which is how I got started, reconciliation behavior, was actually discovered by me in captivity, and then there's many studies in the field now that have confirmed that behavior. Yeah.
So the most recent book is The Bonobo and the Atheist. What are you working on now? Well, you have a new area of
I'm working on a
interest?
book on animal intelligence, and I mean animals in a broad sense, not just the primates. Because there's now every week an article coming out in the newspapers. Well, newspaper is an old-fashioned concept, but on the internet, let's say, there's every week something coming out about crows using tools or octopus or whatever the species is. And so I feel like reviewing what we now know about that.
So have you been working with new animals that you've previously not
I'm not
worked with?
working. No, I was still working with the primates.
But you're sort of gathering studies that other people have done.
I'm sort of reviewing that field and also going over the history, because people tend to forget. People are now so open to this sort of issue, but 25 years ago you could not say animal cognition was actually a contradiction in terms. Cognition was for humans and animals didn't have that. And there's still people around in the world who will deny animals emotions, for example. I always say if they don't have emotions, they don't have cognition, what's left? They probably have nothing. Yeah, but of course they would argue they're like machines, but that's not a very popular notion anymore.
No, I mean, anyone who owns a dog knows that they have emotions. I mean, that's obvious.
But then the question is, how do we measure? How do we know what it is? What are they good for? Why do we need emotions? Could we be just sort of robots who don't have emotions?
So we just have a couple of minutes left. You're a scientist, but you do your work in the age of TED Talks and the internet, and you're also a public intellectual. Is it difficult for you to wear those two hats? To be studying your primates and then be invited to the University of Oregon to give public lectures? Is this something that you...
No, I don't see that as a contradiction. I have always felt I need to do both. I was familiar with Desmond Morris, who's a popularizer, who was a serious scientist, then became a popularizer, and that's all he meant to do. And very quickly people dismissed him and said, oh, this is just Desmond Morris, just a vulgarizer. And I've always tried to avoid that. I've always said, well, I'm happy to popularize because I think it needs to be done. Someone needs to do it, and it's better that the scientists do it than somebody else. So, but I will keep my research going, partly to feed, of course, new information, but also because I saw that there was a danger if you do that. And so if you are a public intellectual and you work in a public arena, it does create tensions with colleagues who are either jealous or don't want you to do that or think it's nonsense to do that. But the general public is, of course, very appreciative because they want to hear from a real scientist what's going on rather than from a journalist in general. Yeah.
Well, thank you for your willingness to share with the public like me. And thanks very much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you. You're welcome.
I've been speaking with primatologist Frans de Waal. He gave a talk titled The Evolution of Connectivity, Empathy, Altruism, and Primate Social Skills on March 10th, 2015 as the Clark Lecturer in this year's OHC Connection series. Thanks so much for watching.